I knew the HOA in this neighborhood was bad, but I didn't realize just how bad until they messed with my business. My name's Tobias Ellroy, and I own the only construction firm in this county. That means every housing project, every road repair, and every major renovation around here goes through me. I built half the homes in this neighborhood, including my own. But that didn't stop our HOA president, Karren Whitmore, from making my life miserable. It all started when I bought an empty lot at the edge of the neighborhood. I had plans to build a few rental properties, something modern but tasteful. It wasn't even part of the HOA's jurisdiction, but that didn't stop Karren from trying to control it. She showed up at my door one evening, her arms crossed tight over her pastel cardigan. "You can't just start construction without approval from the HOA board," she announced, like she was delivering some royal decree. I leaned against my doorframe. "Karren, the lot isn't part of the HOA. You don't have any say over it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's still visible from the neighborhood, and we have certain aesthetic standards. We'll need to review your plans." I laughed. "That's not how this works." She didn't like that answer. The next morning, my delivery trucks were stopped at the neighborhood entrance. I got a call from my site manager, telling me that some woman with a clipboard was blocking the road, refusing to let them pass. I didn't need to ask who it was. I drove down there myself, and sure enough, there was Karren, standing in front of my trucks like she was some kind of traffic cop. A couple of her HOA cronies stood behind her, nodding along as she waved her clipboard around. "You can't bring heavy equipment through here," she said when I stepped out of my truck. "This is a residential area. The HOA has rules about commercial traffic." I exhaled sharply. "Karren, this road is public. You don't have the authority to block it." She tilted her chin up. "We maintain these roads. Our community has agreed that large trucks aren't allowed to disrupt the peaceful atmosphere." I glanced at my drivers who were leaning against their trucks, arms crossed, waiting for my signal. I turned back to Karren. "Fine, you want to play this game? I'll play." What she didn't realize yet was that I had more power than she thought. I wasn't just some guy trying to build a few houses. I controlled the infrastructure, and she had just made a very big mistake. Karren had no idea what she had just started. Blocking my delivery trucks wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. She thought she could push me around like I was some random homeowner who didn't know the rules. But I wasn't just any homeowner. I was the guy who made sure the roads she was standing on were maintained. And if she wanted to play hardball, then I was more than happy to return the favor. Instead of arguing with her right then and there, I turned to my drivers and told them to head back to the main yard. They didn't look happy about it, but they knew me well enough to trust I had a plan. Karren looked pleased with herself, standing there like she had won some great victory. She had no idea what was coming. That afternoon, I made a few phone calls. First, to the county office to confirm what I already knew: the road leading into the neighborhood was public, and the HOA had no legal authority to block it. Then I called the county's road maintenance division. See, what Karren didn't realize was that my company handled all the contracted road repairs for this area. And since she wanted to claim the HOA maintained the roads, I decided it was time to show her what that really meant. Early the next morning, before most of the neighborhood was even awake, my crew rolled in with heavy machinery. We started marking sections of the entrance road for urgent maintenance. Bright orange cones lined the street, and large signs went up warning of extended roadwork. By the time Karren emerged from her house in her usual pastel-colored outfit, the entrance to the neighborhood was already partially dug up. She stormed toward me, fury in her eyes. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she demanded. I barely glanced up from the clipboard I was holding. "Emergency road maintenance. Since you said the HOA maintains these roads, I figured you wouldn't mind a little upkeep." Her face turned red. "You can't just tear up the street. I never approved this." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but I thought you were in charge of the roads here. That's what you told me yesterday when you blocked my trucks. If that's the case, then you should have already scheduled this work. She sputtered for a moment, clearly trying to figure out a way to backpedal. This is unnecessary. You're just doing this to be difficult. I shrugged. Actually, this section was due for resurfacing anyway. My company handles the county's road maintenance contracts, and according to my records, this area was long overdue. If you'd like to file a complaint, you're welcome to take it up with the county office. She looked like she wanted to argue further, but she knew she had no ground to stand on. Meanwhile, my crew continued working, tearing up more of the road and making it impossible for anyone to block my trucks again. By the time we were finished, there was no way she could stop me from getting my deliveries through. The road was now officially under construction, and traffic had to be allowed through to accommodate the workers. That meant my trucks had priority access. Karren tried to fight back in other ways. Over the next few days, she sent me a series of ridiculous violation notices, claiming my construction site was an eyesore and that it was bringing down property values. None of the complaints had any legal weight, of course, but she was desperate to find some way to make my life difficult. I decided it was time to put an end to this nonsense once and for all. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up unannounced. The moment I walked in, Karren's face twisted in irritation, but she had no choice but to acknowledge me. The room was packed with residents, most of whom had no idea about the mess she had caused. I walked straight to the front and placed a thick folder on the table. I think it's time we addressed some issues regarding the HOA's overreach, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Murmurs spread through the room. Karren forced a tight smile. Tobias, this isn't on the agenda. I met her gaze. It is now. Then I opened the folder and began laying out every instance of her HOA abusing its power blocking public roads, attempting to control property outside their jurisdiction, issuing baseless fines, and even trying to interfere with legally approved construction. I had documentation for everything. The residents weren't happy. Many of them had already been frustrated with the HOA, but now they had cold, hard proof that their leadership was acting outside the law. People started demanding answers, calling for votes to remove Karren from her position. She tried to regain control, but it was too late. The damage was done. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been passed to investigate the HOA's leadership. Karren's grip on power was slipping, and she knew it. As I walked out of that meeting, I caught her glaring at me. I just gave her a nod and left, knowing full well that her reign over this neighborhood was coming to an end. And the best part, my construction project was moving forward without a single obstacle in sight. Karren had no idea how much worse things were going to get for her. After the HOA meeting, word spread fast. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up before started coming forward with their own grievances. Stories of unjust fines, arbitrary rule changes, and outright bullying poured in. I didn't have to do much from that point. Karren had already made enough enemies. I just gave them the push they needed to fight back. The neighborhood had been under her grip for years, but now cracks were forming in her control. People were finally realizing they didn't have to put up with her nonsense, and there was nothing she hated more than losing power. Desperation made people reckless, and Karren was no exception. A few days after the meeting, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. It was an official-looking document, stamped and signed a cease and desist order claiming my construction project was in violation of newly established community development guidelines. She was trying to change the rules after the fact to shut me down. I didn't even bother getting angry. It was pathetic, really. Karren was drowning, and this was her last, flailing attempt to drag herself back up, but she had just made another critical mistake. She was assuming I would just accept this at face value. That was never going to happen. Instead of responding, I went straight to my lawyer. He took one look at the letter, laughed, and told me exactly what I already knew: it had no legal standing. The HOA had no authority over my lot, and even if they did, they couldn't retroactively enforce new rules on a project that was already approved. Karren had overstepped again. But I wasn't just going to ignore it. No, I wanted to make sure she felt the consequences of her actions. The next day, I paid a visit to the county zoning office. Had a good relationship with the folks there after all. My company worked closely with them on every major construction project in the area. When I showed them the letter Karren had sent me, they weren't happy. Apparently, this wasn't the first time she had tried to interfere with property she had no control over. She had been filing complaints for years, trying to block permits, stall renovations, and push out homeowners who didn't follow her vision for the neighborhood. Most of her attempts had been ignored, but now that she was actively trying to disrupt a legally approved project, the county was ready to take action. A formal complaint was filed against the HOA for attempting to enforce regulations outside their jurisdiction. That meant an official investigation into their activities, which included a full audit of their finances. That was when things really started to unravel. The audit uncovered some very interesting things. It turned out the HOA had been mismanaging funds for years. Karren had been using HOA money for personal expenses, paying for landscaping on her own property, taking business trips that had nothing to do with the neighborhood, even covering the cost of renovations for a few of her close friends on the board. When the news broke, the neighborhood exploded. People were furious. They had been paying HOA fees for years, only to find out that their money had been lining Karren's pockets. Residents who had once been too afraid to challenge her were now demanding her immediate resignation. Karren tried to fight back. She claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that the expenses were justified, that everything had been approved by the board. But no one was buying it anymore. At the next HOA meeting, she was met with open hostility. People were shouting, demanding answers, waving copies of the audit report in her face. She tried to maintain her usual condescending composure, but for the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes. The board had no choice but to hold an emergency vote. The result was unanimous. Karren was removed as HOA president effective immediately. She didn't take it well. She stood there, shaking, her face pale, as the reality of her situation sank in. Everything she had built, the power she had hoarded over this neighborhood, was gone in an instant. But that wasn't the worst of it. With the HOA under new leadership, the board members who had been complicit in her schemes were also removed. The new board wasted no time in making changes. All the ridiculous rules Karren had put in place were overturned, including the ones about commercial traffic. My construction project moved forward without another hitch. But the final blow came a few weeks later when legal action was taken against Karren for embezzlement. The mismanaged HOA funds weren't just a violation of trust, they were a crime. She was facing real consequences now, and there was no way out. When I saw her packing up her house, loading boxes into a moving truck, she wouldn't even look at me. I didn't say anything either. Just watched as she drove away, knowing she had brought all of this on herself. The neighborhood was finally free, and my project, it was going to be the best thing to ever happen to this community. With Karren gone, the neighborhood finally felt like it could breathe again. The new HOA board wasted no time in undoing the damage she had caused. People who had been fined for absurd reasons saw their fees refunded, pointless restrictions were lifted, and most importantly, my construction project moved forward without any more interference. But just because Karren was out of the picture didn't mean everything was smooth sailing. The mess she left behind took time to clean up. The HOA's finances were in shambles, and the new board had to work overtime to set things right. Homeowners, now aware of how their money had been misused, were hesitant to trust any leadership, and rightfully so. The neighborhood meetings became intense as people demanded transparency and real change. Kept my distance from most of it. Had fought my battle and won. But my involvement in exposing Karren's corruption had made me something of a local hero. Neighbors who had barely given me a second glance before now stopped me to thank me. Some wanted my opinion on how to handle certain community issues, while others just wanted reassurance that another Karren wouldn't take over. One evening, as I was checking the progress on my construction site, Tom Henshaw, the newly elected HOA president, walked up to me. He was a retired firefighter, well-respected in the community and nothing like Karren. Where she had been all about control, Tom was focused on fixing what had been broken. He leaned on the temporary fence surrounding the site, watching as my crew worked. After a moment, he turned to me. "Tobias, I won't lie to you. The HOA's still a mess. We've got people arguing over what to do next, and there's talk of dissolving it entirely." I nodded, not surprised. After what Karren pulled, people aren't exactly eager to keep handing over their money. Tom sighed. "I don't blame them. But without some kind of structure, this place could turn into chaos. We need someone on the board who actually understands how things work. Someone who won't let power go to their head." I already knew where this was going. I shook my head. "Tom, if you're about to ask me to join the board, save your breath. I don't have the patience for that kind of thing." He chuckled. "Figured you'd say that. But think about it, if we had someone like you keeping an eye on things, we'd never end up with another Karren." I considered it for a second, but ultimately shook my head again. I'll help where I can, but sitting in meetings arguing over bylaws isn't my thing. Tom accepted that answer, but before he left, he gave me a knowing look. "Just don't be surprised if half the neighborhood starts looking to you for leadership anyway." He wasn't wrong. Over the next few weeks, people kept coming to me with concerns, some about lingering HOA issues, others about general neighborhood maintenance. After years of dealing with Karren's nonsense, they were desperate for someone who knew what they were doing. I ended up helping more than I expected. When residents had questions about property laws, I pointed them in the right direction. When the new board needed advice on hiring contractors for road repairs, I gave them recommendations. Even helped organize a community meeting where homeowners could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Through it all, I realized something. This neighborhood wasn't just where I lived. It was a place I had built, literally. I had poured my sweat into these homes, these streets, and now, in a way, I was helping rebuild something else trust. The construction on my new rental properties moved quickly now that there were no roadblocks. The houses, modern yet fitting the character of the neighborhood, were nearly complete. The same people who had once worried that my project would ruin the aesthetic were now asking when the homes would be available. Some even admitted they were glad Karren hadn't gotten her way. One afternoon, as I was finishing up a final inspection of the first completed house, I spotted a moving truck pulling up to one of the older homes down the street. A couple climbed out, looking around with cautious curiosity. New homeowners. I walked over, offering a handshake. "Welcome to the neighborhood." The man, probably in his early 40s, shook my hand firmly. "Thanks, we heard things were a little tense around here before." I chuckled. That's one way to put it, but things are changing for the better. His wife smiled. "That's good to hear. We were worried about the HOA, but the realtor said there's new leadership now." I nodded. "Yes, and trust me, they're nothing like the last one." As they started unpacking, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The neighborhood had been under Karren's control for too long, but now it had a chance to become something better. Not just a place where people lived, but a real community. And while I had no intention of running things, I knew I'd always be there to make sure no one like Karren ever took over again. The changes in the neighborhood weren't instant, but they were steady. Without Karren micromanaging everything, people finally had the freedom to make their own decisions without fear of retaliation. Yards that had been forced into strict uniformity started reflecting the personalities of the homeowners. Fences went up. Some properties got fresh coats of paint in colors that would have made Karren faint, and best of all, the ridiculous fines disappeared. The new HOA board, led by Tom, was doing its best to regain the trust of the residents. They held open meetings where every homeowner was encouraged to voice concerns. Instead of arbitrary rules, decisions were made based on what was best for the majority. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the dictatorship Karren had run. Meanwhile, my construction project was nearing completion. The rental properties were built exactly how I had planned: modern, functional, and well integrated into the neighborhood. The demand for them was higher than I expected. Families looking for a fresh start, young professionals, and even a few retirees wanted in. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karren had fought so hard to stop this development, and yet it was quickly becoming one of the most desirable parts of the neighborhood. I was in the middle of finalizing lease agreements when I got an unexpected visitor. An older man, dressed in a pressed suit, stepped onto my construction site. His sharp eyes scanned the nearly completed houses before settling on me. He introduced himself as a county investigator. At first, I thought he was there about my permits, but I had dotted every I and crossed every T. When he pulled out a folder and handed it to me, I quickly realized this had nothing to do with my project. It had everything to do with Karren. The investigation into the HOA's finances had uncovered more than just mismanagement. Karren's little empire had been built on more than power. She had been funneling money into personal accounts, using fake invoices to hide it. Her landscaping expenses were actually payments to a private contractor who did work on her vacation home in another state. The business trips were nothing more than luxury getaways funded by HOA dues. The county had enough evidence to charge her with fraud and embezzlement, but they needed statements from homeowners who had been directly affected. That's where I came in. My construction project had been targeted, my trucks illegally blocked, and I had the receipts to prove it. I didn't hesitate to cooperate. I handed over every document. I had Karren's cease and desist letter, the footage from my security cameras showing her blocking my trucks, and even the emails she had sent trying to shut me down. The investigator took everything, thanking me for my time. As he left, I couldn't help but think about how Karren had started this war over nothing but control. Now, she was facing real consequences for her actions. A few weeks later, news broke that Karren had been officially charged. She had tried to fight it, of course, hiring an expensive lawyer and claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign. But the evidence was overwhelming. The county had bank statements, transaction records, and testimony from multiple residents. The moment the neighborhood found out, it was like a weight had been lifted. People who had once been afraid of crossing her now openly laughed about how the mighty had fallen. Some of the worst HOA enforcers, the ones who had supported Karren's every move, suddenly went quiet, pretending they had never been on her side. One evening, I found myself at a neighborhood gathering. Tom had organized a barbecue in the community park, a way to bring people together after years of division. The atmosphere was relaxed, people chatting, kids running around, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood actually felt like a community. Tom approached me as I was grabbing a plate of food. He had a satisfied look on his face. "I heard Karren's trial date is set," he said. "She's trying to negotiate a deal, but the county isn't letting her off easy." I nodded. Good. She spent years thinking she was untouchable. Now she's learning what happens when you cross too many people. Tom chuckled. "You know, when you first moved in, I figured you were just another guy trying to keep his head down. Never thought you'd be the one to take her down." I glanced around the park at the people who had once feared Karren's wrath. They weren't afraid anymore. "She did it to herself," I said simply. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. Well, whatever the case, this neighborhood's better off because of it. As the sun set and the gathering continued, I realized he was right. The neighborhood had changed for the better. And while hadn't set out to be a hero, I had made sure that no one like Karren would ever have control over this place again. The past was finally behind us, and for the first time in years, the future looked bright. The neighborhood had changed, but I wasn't done just yet. With Karren out of the picture and my construction project nearly complete, I had one last thing to take care of, a final nail in the coffin to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. I had spent months dealing with Karren's nonsense, but she wasn't the only problem. The HOA itself, even under new leadership, still held too much unchecked power. Tom was doing a solid job keeping things fair, but I knew from experience that one good leader wouldn't be enough to prevent another Karren from rising in the future. If we wanted real, lasting change, we needed to take the power out of the HOA's hands entirely. So I did what I do best. I made a plan. I spent the next several weeks digging into the HOA's foundational documents, researching state laws, and talking to lawyers who specialized in community governance. What I found was exactly what I had hoped for. The HOA could be dissolved. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. The hardest part was convincing the homeowners. Many of them had lived under Karren's rule for so long that they assumed an HOA was necessary, even if it had been mismanaged. They worried that without it, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. I knew better. Had built entire subdivisions without HOAs, and they thrived just fine. If anything, they were better off without a small group of people controlling every aspect of their lives. The key was getting enough homeowners on board to vote for dissolution. According to the HOA's bylaws, we needed a 2/3 majority to shut it down. That meant knocking on doors, explaining the benefits, and countering the fears people had. I wasn't alone in this fight. Many residents were still furious about how Karren had abused her power, and they were eager to make sure it never happened again. They helped gather signatures, organize meetings, and spread the word. The opposition came from the few remaining board members who had been close to Karren. Even though they had been voted out of leadership roles, they still held influence over some residents. They tried to argue that without an HOA, property values would plummet, the streets would fall into disrepair, and the neighborhood would become a free-for-all. Countered every argument with facts. Property values had already gone up since Karren was removed, thanks to the renewed sense of community and the new homes I was building. The streets were maintained by the county, not the HOA, which meant nothing would change on that front. As for the fear of chaos, that was just scare tactics from people who wanted to keep their power. Little by little, the tide turned. When the official vote was held, the meeting hall was packed. Homeowners filled every available seat, and some stood against the walls, eager to have their say. The tension in the room was thick as the ballots were counted. When the final numbers were announced, the result was undeniable. We had the 2/3 majority. The HOA was officially dissolved. There was a brief moment of silence as the realization sank in. Then, the room erupted into cheers. People shook hands, clapped each other on the back, and celebrated the fact that they were finally free. The former board members who had fought against the dissolution sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to process their loss. They had spent years controlling this neighborhood, and now that control was gone. Tom shook my hand, a look of relief on his face. He had done his best to lead the HOA fairly, but even he had seen the writing on the wall. This was the best outcome for everyone. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood transitioned smoothly into a self-governing community. Homeowners took responsibility for their own properties. Disputes were handled neighbor to neighbor instead of by a power-hungry board, and the atmosphere became more relaxed. As for me, I finally finished my construction project. The new homes were rented out, and the families who moved in fit right into the neighborhood. There were no more ridiculous restrictions, no more power struggles, just people living their lives without interference. A few months later, I was sitting on my front porch, watching the sun set over the houses I had built. The neighborhood had come a long way from the mess it had been when Karren was in charge. I had set out to build homes, but in the process, I had helped build something even more important, a community that could stand on its own. And as I watched kids playing in the yards, neighbors chatting on their porches, and the streets filled with life, I knew one thing for certain. No one like Karren would ever control this place again.